Hey everyone, and welcome to Generative Now. I am Michael Mignano. I'm a partner at Lightspeed, and for this episode, I was thrilled to sit down with Soumith Chintala for a conversation about generative AI innovation at one of the world's largest tech companies, Meta. Soumith is a VP at Meta, and he co-created one of the world's most beloved ML libraries, PyTorch. And so he has clearly had a front row seat to the rise of AI over the past couple of years at Meta, and previously as a researcher at NYU. We spoke about all things AI on the Generative NYC stage, which is a series of live in-person events for founders, builders, and investors, hosted by Lightspeed here in New York City. So if you weren't able to attend, you're in luck because we have the full conversation right here. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Soumith Chintala, VP at Meta.
What's up?
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, for sure.
You are famously known as one of the creators of PyTorch. Why don't you give us your story and how it led to PyTorch, and maybe tell us a little about one of the world's most beloved ML libraries?
Sure, yeah. First, how many people know what PyTorch is?
A lot.
That's more than I expected, actually. Because one of the things that's interesting these days is AI, especially Gen AI, has gotten so commoditized that people don't actually need to know a lot of lower level details. They kind of call into various models. And so I was just interested to understand how many people actually still know the lower level libraries. So PyTorch is interesting. I'm an AI researcher. I started working in AI in 2009 or so. And mostly I was involved in open source, partly because I was bored and also partly because I liked that spirit of learning things online, contributing to things. As I was building a bunch of AI research, the tools I was using at that time weren't as fun. And there was this tool at that time called Torch that was built by some other people. And I kind of started hanging out with them on their GitHub, started answering people. Eventually, I landed a job at Meta with offers from other AI companies just because I was doing that work. And the way tools go, I'm sure you can relate to this, is as you use tools to express your ideas, you build a bunch of great ideas, and then the tools that you used eventually get outdated, and you kind of need to build new tools. It's like the updating of technology, right? So at some point, Torch, which was a library we were building and using, was starting to get outdated. I did one research project in 2015, which was around getting to state-of-the-art object recognition, take a picture, look at objects, identify objects, and it was super painful. So around that time, I just decided with a few other people that we'll attempt a refresh, let's rewrite it for ideas that are being explored at the current time. And that's how we built it. Honestly, we didn't have a grand vision. We were PyTorch is gonna be this big thing that a bunch of people will use in the world. We kind of built it mostly for ourselves, and it just ended up being pretty useful for other people. And simultaneously, AI has expanded, the market the addressable market has expanded quite a lot, and I think that just made PyTorch become a bigger deal than I've actually ever imagined it.
So you didn't expect it to sort of become such an integral, important part of the ecosystem, but how did that actually happen? Did it just happen organically on GitHub? Did you do things that sort of pushed it in that direction?
Actually, it's a basic startup playbook. You kind of build the feedback loops. You kind of understand everyone who's using your product. You go talk to them, you try to help them, and then anyone posts about it online, you kind of, if it's they're showcasing their work built on top of PyTorch, we amplified it. We kind of built a community of people whose identity of why they connected with each other was because they used PyTorch.
Right.
Building that ecosystem and then having all these people who know PyTorch talk to each other about PyTorch and building that network of support that made PyTorch not just be like a great technology tool, but also a great technology tool that had crazy amount of support that you just Googled any problem you had, you got answers that someone else faced and all those network effects. So I think that is what most people in this room do when they're growth hacking. I saw someone handing out cards on like, oh, this is like a scheduling agent. You should just use that. It's like, it's the same kind of tricks, yeah.
So I realize most of the people in the room, I think, raised their hands, but maybe for the people who didn't, we probably should level set a little bit and explain what exactly PyTorch is.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Most of generative AI is built on top of this fundamental computer science machine learning concept called neural networks. They have nothing to do with like brains. They're just like mathematical equations that learn statistical patterns from data. And PyTorch is a library that allows you to build these neural networks really, really efficiently. And if you have ideas and thoughts of how to build different kinds of neural networks, it makes it easy. And you probably are using PyTorch as a consumer of those neural networks between OpenAI's ChatGPT, almost any of like the Meta apps you use, Tesla cars, NASA. I mean, you don't use NASA rockets, but like AstraZeneca, the drug maker, like basically it's now percolated into most of the world that does AI and deploys it uses PyTorch. Like I took my dog to the vet the other day, and the vet had this like AI cancer screening thing, and they actually use PyTorch. And
so you never expected this to happen. You never expected all these different applications to be built on it. But now they have, maybe outside of like that vet experience, are there any that, you sort of pinch yourself and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe this is built using this thing that we created?
I get very nervous whenever we find a bug because, I mean, Tesla cars and cruise taxis or whatever, like, all these things. If I'm sitting in a Tesla and you turn on the AI driving, I'm like, I hope I didn't write any bugs.
What's it been like doing all this from inside Meta? You said you ran like sort of the classic startup playbook, but you're doing all of this inside of one of the largest companies in the world. What's that like? Do you get the resources and the support, or is it really like you are a startup?
Yeah, I think general rule of thumb working in a large company is if you try to follow everything by the book, like basically you don't get much done. So you try to figure out how to build the best things while navigating bureaucracy and stuff like that. Meta has this culture of open source. React came out of Meta, Open Compute, like a bunch of well-known products like Presto. So culturally, like Meta was super positive about open source in general. We got the right amount of support as we needed it, but like the shape of people inside of Meta aren't really like people who understand how to growth hack and all of that. Like it's more like you're a large company engineer and you have a well-defined role, and there's not a lot of ambiguity in how you build and do things. So there's a little bit of navigating that, but it was fine.
Yeah. So, maybe sort of talking a little bit more broadly about Meta and open source. Obviously, Llama is a huge deal and a huge focus. What role has PyTorch maybe played in the development and the rollout, the strategy of Llama?
Yeah, I think Llama came extremely naturally to us at Meta. I work on the Llama project indirectly, like I help them with all their software and hardware side of things. When it came to Llama and releasing it in open source, honestly, we didn't really think twice about it. It wasn't even like, should we release it and what is like the value for us? It's pretty obvious that we should do this, right? And I think we've always played this strategy, just releasing technology, and if the technology, like the accelerated deployment of the technology helps the world, then it probably helps us. Like that's how we started FAIR, which was the AI research lab. We were just like, we need AI for Meta to progress. Like a lot of Meta's product needs need AI, like for content moderation and various other like things. And we're just like, AI is not progressing fast enough. So let's start an AI research lab that just publishes everything into the open and then just accelerates AI progress. And that will indirectly help Meta, and like the applied teams use the open research labs technology backward. So Llama is like a pretty similar play. Like we want the acceleration of Gen AI into products in meaningful ways, and we need to understand these safety implications of them, and there's no better way than to get people to like try to break them in all kinds of ways. So that's just been super natural for us.
It definitely makes sense that it's been natural for Meta to just say, hey, we should make a push with Llama because it's good for the world, therefore it would be good for us. But it very much seems like an intentional strategy now, right? Like it's one of the main things Zuck is talking about in the earnings call. You know, the company is dedicating many, you know, H100s to the project. Like it seems like a very, very deliberate strategy now. What can you tell us about the strategy of Llama and open source AI now for Meta?
Yeah, I think like open sourcing Llama was pretty natural, and as I mentioned, like it's almost in our DNA to open source. So like it is intentional, but like also like we don't think deliberately about it. But generally, like the AI race that is happening, I think you mentioned like, you know, Zuck talks about it in a bunch of earnings call and stuff. I mean, what's happening right now is multiple companies are trying to build foundational AI models which have a certain level of intelligence because they see those models as being valuable. And the current state of things is a bit unknown and weird in that we're in a state where we're just starting to see that you can build more and more intelligent models by throwing more and more data at it and throwing certain kinds of data at it. We haven't really reached like the upper cap of intelligence, but I think the other interesting thing we haven't reached is how much intelligence is useful from a product perspective. For example, like let's just say you take Llama 405B that Zuck talked about that we're training and eventually hoping to release. Let's say Llama 405B, which is our largest model, is let's say 30% smarter than Llama 70B. Let's just assume that. But let's just say it costs like 10 times as much to serve. These are all made up numbers. But like if you take that into account, you need to start thinking about, oh, maybe actually most of business value and product value will be extracted by 70B or 7B or 3B. So maybe building the most intelligent model might not be like cost viable.
Right.
But it might still give you like a technological advantage. I think these are the complexities that haven't been figured out. And people are just starting to figure out that having a single prompt that serves all users across the world does not really work. Like it doesn't work culturally, it doesn't work contextually. Like for example, ChatGPT has a single system prompt for everyone in the world, right? It doesn't have any understanding of like local sensitivities and stuff. So I think like AI models, Gen AI models also need to go through a personalization revolution. That I think is very early in the overall exploration. We're figuring it out. I think like people recognize that there's something fundamentally valuable about Gen AI models. They're doing useful things. How to use them, what are their limits, what are like how to build products out of it. All of these things are pretty unknown.
Yeah. Speaking of OpenAI, in addition to your work at Meta, which I find super interesting, I also enjoy your tweets. And you've put out some really interesting and thought-provoking tweets lately that I thought we could talk about here a little bit. You know, recently you commented on the whole ScarJo situation, which for those of you who maybe live under a rock and don't know what I'm talking about, OpenAI came out with a new model recently, GPT-4o. There was a multimodal voice component to it, which sounded like Scarlett Johansson, and now there's potentially a lawsuit from Scarlett Johansson. There's a lot to the story. I won't get into the whole story here, but I have a question for you, Soumith, based on one of your tweets you put out. Let's just say there is some sort of legal situation. Like, how might this very, very specific micro incident potentially lead to legislation around AI, around training, around output, around input that may have ripples that may lead all the way to some of the stuff that you are doing at Meta or other people are doing at OpenAI or other large research labs. I think it's super interesting that this has gotten very personal on an individual that many people find beloved.
Yeah. People in current society have economic rights based on various aspects, right? Like they have intellectual property rights, they have copyrights, they have likeness rights. There's various things that people have baked into how they optimize their lives. And some of those rights, I think, are being questioned by AI models. And I think the Scarlett Johansson incident is a way for people have been getting a little unhappy in various fields. For example, the Screenwriters Association, the various, various creative artists of all kinds have been getting unhappy. They need moments like these to solidify what they're trying to express, right? They're like, we don't think this looks right, and we all need to coordinate and come together and express that this is not according to the current social norms. And I think these moments are going to allow people to understand each other, organize with each other, and then question whether that's the direction in which you want to take society or not. Like, do we preserve some of these rights that will be harder to keep around with AI technology, or do we want to not preserve these rights? And those are things that are both social and legal. I think just throwing it into the legal system would not resolve the problem. It has to be socially addressed and legally addressed. And I think more moments like these probably will appear. I think Scarlett Johansson's one is just one of many that will appear and will test how society responds to this technology and evolve itself. We'll see where this goes. I think it's super positive to have people who feel a certain resentment for AI have these moments and organize themselves.
Yeah, it almost sounds like what you're saying is, yes, it'll play out in the courts. That could take a decade. In the meantime, it could play out in the market, like people voting with their dollars or their feet or whatever the phrase is. Maybe on a similar situation, there was also this OpenAI equity clawback situation around employees leaving, OpenAI really wanting to protect IP and trade secrets. I think there was a lot of blowback against this. I want to ask you, somebody else who works in a very, obviously a big lab that's investing a lot in AI and probably has a lot of trade secrets. Like, I know this is not the norm, but maybe given the high stakes that everyone's playing in right now, secrets are that valuable and they're worth this type of situation? Or should we all be saying, hey, what did Ilya see?
It's not about the secrets, actually.
Okay.
I think a lot of the resentment OpenAI got for their situation is that it was a bait and switch.
Yeah.
That when you showed up on day one, you signed your employee contracts, they didn't tell you that there will be this agreement that you have to sign at the end, and the language of that agreement is unknown to you until you decide to quit. And that agreement's going to have all kinds of extreme language in the rights that you might have. And if you don't sign it, they might take away a bunch of the money that you felt you already earned, right? I don't think if this is upfront, like when the day you show up or before you sign your offer, they say, after, you have to go on garden leave or something. This is super common in finance. Finance does this all the time where someone's working at a hedge fund and they know all the secrets. They quit, they're forced to just chill for 6 to 12 months while they're getting paid. And that's the thing they signed, right? I think the problem was people who joined OpenAI didn't know when they joined that when they quit, they're gonna have to sign a bunch of this stuff or else their equity is gonna be wiped out.
And the garden leave concept could actually work because the market is moving so fast that actually the things probably will be irrelevant in 6 months.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting comp. So another thing I'm really curious about to get your perspective on, and maybe your perspective is going to be biased because you're at Meta, is the future of this space closed source AI like what OpenAI is working on, or more open source, which is obviously Meta's position?
I think it's like hard to say. I mean, this is the whole like Apple versus Android, and US overwhelmingly uses Apple products, but the world overwhelmingly uses Android products. That's probably because America is a pretty rich country, and Europe probably also has a bunch of Apple. And I think that's going to be one of those trade-offs in like AI as well. Like open source AI is probably not going to be as well integrated and smooth in like all kinds of aspects and ways as a vertically integrated product that uses closed source AI.
Yeah.
But the advantages are it is way more democratizable, right? Anyone can build a product around it without having to go through a bunch of agreements with some central provider and doing things only in a certain way and stuff. So like things like cultural norms, right? Like let's just say like a closed source AI provider out of California is going to have certain set of biases that might not work for a large part of the world. And that might be something open source AI can help democratize faster. I'm sure like the closed source companies will try to work to personalize this to various markets, but the open source stuff gets personalized much faster. And that's what happened with Android versus Apple. So I don't know which way this is going to go, but I think there's a strong chance that there will be multiple segments of markets in which one wins versus the other.
Can anyone compete with Meta on the open source side? This is a capital game, and Meta's got a lot of it. And startups, can they match them?
I think it depends on how long it's a capital game.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the interesting things that hasn't been resolved. That for context, what the capital game is, to train each of these foundation models, it takes tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's predicted that it's going to take billions of dollars. And in terms of capital expenditure, it already takes like a lot of money. And the current hypothesis that the world is running on in AI is if you want to train a smarter model, throw more data and compute at the model, and it's going to get smarter. It's going like, up and to the right. Like the more data and flops you throw at training, the model is getting smarter. But it's not clear when it's going to start to saturate. So as companies train the next version of the model, they might realize that actually like it's starting to taper. And we don't know exactly when that happens and when that's going to happen. It's obviously not going to be like, okay, like it just keeps going up and to the right. First, like we might run out of data, or we might run out of high quality data. I mean, there's all kinds of things, right? I don't know if it's going to continue being a capital game until we capture all energy in the universe or something. Right. It's not like a paperclip game, right? So we'll find out. I think to answer your question, like if it stops being a capital intensive game and it becomes about some other thing, maybe like about human feedback, then it's very much possible that other open source companies might also start competing because it's not about capital anymore.
Right.
Maybe it's about democratization or whatever, right? So we'll see, but I think that's the state of the industry, and there's a lot of unknowns. And
I have questions I could go on all night, but I know there are a bunch of people in the audience that have questions as well, so we're going to shift over to audience Q&A. We have one coming over here. When you get the mic, just please stand up, say your name, say what you work on, and then fire away with your question, please.
Hi, Nick Kidwani. I'm working on a bunch of different things, so I'm really early days. One question I have for you is I think a lot of us are building on top of these foundational models, and the thing I think a lot about is like, if you started building on top of iOS a while ago, you got locked in, right? And you didn't have your destiny. It doesn't feel like there's an obvious way they can lock you in because you can kind of switch them. But at the same time, like all our data is running through them. So I'm curious how you think the foundational models will attempt to create lock-in for the application layer.
That's a good question. I think it's less like building on top of iOS and Android, and it's more like building on top of AWS or GCP or Azure, in that the way you interact with the model is via natural language. But the way the model responds is it has a certain flavor to it. GPT responds slightly differently than Claude, and responds slightly different than Llama. And when you're building a production app and you need it to be reliable, you kind of have a test environment where you're testing multiple of these. I think the lock-ins are going to be created on value adds on top. It's like, hey, if you use our RAG system along with our foundational model, then we can show superior reliability or predictability or determinism versus if you use something else. Or if you use it like entirely within our stack, then we will give you more like volume of APIs because the way we do inference while doing multiple services all at once is better, like maybe latency guarantees and things like that. I think those are the kinds of things that you're going to slowly start getting locked in on. It is possible there are other ways in which you get locked in, but that's my initial thought.
Hi, Matt Gee, CTO of Brighthive. We have a workspace that gives folks AI data agents if you don't have a data team. So it's no secret that Jan LeCun has kind of a dim view on the future of generative models and is putting a lot of fair's weight around non-generative models and JEPA architectures. I'm curious, he talks about that as obviously being the path to AGI, but being 10 years away. For folks like us in the room that are builders, but also want to be building into the future, two kind of questions around that. One is, do you see that shift towards non-generative architectures as something that is relevant to builders in this room that we should be thinking about right now? And two, are tools like PyTorch, still relevant in world models, or are there new open source tools at the low level that need to be built to make that happen?
Okay. I think just a correction, I don't think Jan LeCun is actually against generative models. He basically thinks autoregressive models, which are current transformer-based models, which is what are used in current generation LLMs, they predict one token at a time. So they take in all the previous context and they predict one word. And they take all the previous context again and they predict the next word. Those are called autoregressive models. And he thinks those models in their current form, like with a transformer, are prone to making a bunch of mistakes by design. And he just thinks that you have to significantly improve the structure of transformers to be able to not make mistakes like that. And I think that's actually a very reasonable take. I think there's a lot of it's become like a bit of a culture war rather than any real skepticism. For example, as of today, you look at ChatGPT or Meta AI, the assistant, or several other things. They don't just use a transformer model. They use a retrieval system, they use a search engine, they use a bunch of other things. So when you have other kinds of things that augment your LLM, you might get over some of the limitations that are there if you just use an LLM, which is just an autoregressive model that's predicting one token after the other. You can also explicitly bake in things like reasoning and memory. And I think what he advocates for is look, you want to add explicit reasoning, memory, world model, simulators, things like that, and that would make the model better. And I think the world is already moving into that direction. Tool use is the clearest example of we realize tool use is going to make the models better. And I think he's in agreement with how the world is going towards. He's just making a point that if there was a thesis when GPT-3 first released saying you just need transformers, you just scale them up and everything's going to be amazing. And he was just pushing back against that. So I think you'd mostly be in agreement with him actually. The tools that are you asked PyTorch and all these other tools, will they be used to build these next generation models? I think neural networks are going to be one part of it, and of the whole system. If you think of AI, you're probably going to be it's a multi-component system, and some of these components are neural network thing, and for those you probably will use PyTorch and things like that. But Google search might just be one component. I think a database would just be one component. In terms of humans, like we have like a generic thing called a brain. We don't understand very much of it, but we do understand that it has a reasoning engine. It has this like memory percolated all over. It has various other properties. It has like a motor control area and a language specialization area and stuff. So I think like when we build like AI that's smarter, more useful in all ways, we're going to figure out how to like build a bunch of this stuff. Some of it might be soft components like neural networks. Some of it might be hard components like an actual database. Some of it might be like, somewhere in between. And yeah, I think for some of this, we'll use existing technology that lets you build the soft components. For some of this, you'll just use existing technology that builds those hard components. Some of this might need net new technology.
Well, the next question's getting queued up. I gotta ask, what's it like in Meta's Slack or Workplace or whatever when Jan LeCun and Elon Musk go head to head on X?
Honestly, we don't notice or care.
Come on.
We're just too busy doing work. Like,
good point.
like, okay, someone, like, if you're on a break having lunch or something, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, did you see Jan LeCun and Elon Musk, like, tweeted at each other? It's like, ha ha ha, great. Like,
I don't know if everyone like rallied around Jan, if like, he walks through the halls and people are like cheering him or something.
no.
Okay. Next question.
Hello, my name is Philip. I also work on a bunch of things. My question is about bottlenecks. So like you mentioned there was one bottleneck, the capital game, and then you also mentioned there was another one regarding human feedback. That might be a sooner bottleneck. One sub-narrative that I've heard of a lot is the bottleneck of energy. A lot of people, I think Mark Zuckerberg mentioned that like energy will be a very, in the near future, it'll be the first bottleneck. And then I think Amazon also invested into like a nuclear project. Do you think, two questions around that. Do you think that that is a legitimate bottleneck, like from your perspective, like, or is it all a overhyped narrative, one? And then two, if it is a legitimate bottleneck, where do you think it lies? Like, is it going to come first before the data bottleneck, or is it going to come after?
That's a good question. We run, largely the world runs on capitalism as a concept. And there's enough energy in the world to do various things, power these lights, run a data center and all that. And there's more new energy sources being created, both sustainable and unsustainable. And they're largely priced out, right? Like, you want to buy a unit of energy, you have to pay something. I think if you keep seeing these models get more and more intelligent, and you're like, oh, I need to train like a bigger model because it's going to be more intelligent, at some point, economic pressures are going to catch up. Both the energy prices will inflate, right? Like, they're like, oh, there's more demand than supply. Okay, energy prices will appropriately change. And there's also going to be a value proposition for the model. It's like, okay, like I train a bigger model. Right now, the current race, I would describe it as like a winner takes all race, where a lot of companies are assuming that if they have the more intelligent model than like anyone else, they can get more value out of it in terms of like, extracting value from the world than other companies. So like they're like, if I have the most intelligent model, it's disproportionately more important than if I have the second most intelligent model. That's the premise with which people are running on, which is why there's this like irrational investment right now where without knowing how you're gonna like make any money out of these models, you're investing into it. And based on various economic pressures, cash in hand at various companies, amount of investment people are willing to put in, and general inflation and economic things, I think it will be figured out. If we do get to a place where there's just a lot of demand, like you train a larger model, it's getting more important, and it's going to be disproportionately more important, I think there would be a limit, both physical in terms of how much net new infrastructure you can build at what pace, and how much energy do we have at what price. Those eventually will catch up, in my opinion. So I don't think we're going to go build Dyson spheres around stars or anything crazy like that.
Soumith, thank you so much for the time. I learned a ton. I'm sure they all did as well. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for listening to Generative Now. If you liked what you heard, please rate and review the podcast. That does help. And of course, subscribe so you get notified every time we drop a new episode. Generative Now is produced by Lightspeed in partnership with Pod People. I am Michael Mignano, and we will be back next week. See you then. Thanks.